podcast for Sociology 3U03. I'm Dr. Tina Fetner, and this is Module 10. Today's module is on sexual violence, which is a very personal and dark topic for many people. I just want to start the module by saying that I am completely aware that many of the students taking this course have experienced sexual violence in their personal histories, and so this may be a difficult topic for some of our students. In fact, there are a large number of people who experience sexual assault. We have data from 2004 that show that 500,000 Canadians are victims of sexual assault each year. This is a sizable number of the population. So if you think about this on an annual basis happening over the course of people's lives, that's a lot of our colleagues, our families, our friends, and of course ourselves who may have experienced sexual assault. Almost all sexual assaults go unreported. The ones that actually make it to police is very small. Only 9% of sexual assaults are reported to police departments. But I also want to put this in the context of the larger trends. Sexual assault is declining over time, not increasing, even though our awareness about it might be putting it into sharper relief. All violent crime, battery, assault, both sexual and non-sexual, and even very serious crimes like murder and rape are on the decline. In fact, the world is getting safer in Canada, not more dangerous, and I think this is an important context to understand these sort of high rates of incidents on sexual assault and sexual violence. I also want to talk a little bit about the way that sexual assault is a gendered phenomenon, and this is what we mean when sociologists talk about something being gendered. So it's gendered in two ways. One of the ways is that the people who are at risk of sexual assault are much more likely to be women than men, and it's gendered also in terms of who is committing sexual assaults. Not all, but almost all sexual assaults are committed by men. However, these patterns aren't really necessarily representative of the overall population. Some groups of women are at higher risk than other groups of women for sexual assault, and research suggests, although the findings are not 100% clear at this point, but the state of the research as we know it right now is that kind of a large number of rape and sexual assaults are completed by a small number of repeat offenders, and that this is kind of one part of the problem, and then another part of the problem is a kind of more what you would expect, like somebody committing one or two sexual assault offenses over their lifetimes. Some social contexts are particularly risky for sexual assault, and one of the things that researchers have been turning their attention to lately is the way that university campuses are high-risk settings for sexual violence. We might have expected this to be the case because we already have known for decades that that the age group, especially for women, is risky in young adulthood, the highest risk in kind of early adulthood between, say, 16 and 25, and that the risk of being a victim of sexual violence declines over the life course. Of course, this is not to say that sexual assault does not happen to women in all age categories, but just this disproportionate risk of coming into adulthood is the time when sexual violence is the greatest risk. Universities, of course, capture a lot of people who are in this high-risk age group and then, house them together house them together with men who are, in their risk age group for the most likely time that they will do crimes, etc. And so, just in terms of if the universities didn't add anything else, they're just capturing people at this time when sexual assault is at the highest risk. So the data that we have, and once again, because these are survey results, because most sexual assaults don't get reported to anyone, let alone to a kind of the police that will have to file this data for the government. Best we can tell is somewhere between 1 in 5 and 1 in 4 women undergraduate report experiencing sexual assault, sexual threats, or incapacitation while they are at university. And we also know that university students, or students in general, I should say, are a high proportion of the victims of sexual violence, right? So we know that there is something about the university setting that is unhealthy and makes it prone to sexual violence. And then we have some people who've done some research, some of which you'll read in Module 10, that explore different reasons for why this is the case. I want to bring your attention to one set of theories that talks about the sort of cultural landscape that is permissive in terms of sexual violence. Some theorists have captured this with the concept of rape culture. Right, so rape culture means a few things. It means just statistically, rape is a common feature. This is something that is well established, and you just saw the statistics on that. But rape culture also refers to this idea that sexual violence is not uniformly regarded as a negative thing. That in fact, if we look at the larger culture that we reside in, that we'll see numerous places in our culture where sexual violence is not only permissible, but in certain cases celebrated. And this also extends to include kind of larger, more broader cultural supports for men's dominance over women. So, for example, you might see, if you look into how sexual violence is reported, we see the process of reporting sexual violence as being very hard, very difficult on victims, right? A lot of questioning about sexual histories, about what victims were wearing, about was there any kind of hint that there may have been some kind of permission, a lot of dubious mythology around victim blaming that suggests that being a victim of sexual violence is somehow the fault of the victim. And there's a lot of mythology in our culture that people who are receiving reports of sexual violence tend to draw on these kinds of myths of that real rapes are stranger rapes, and that if you knew the victim, then that it doesn't count. And if you were at a party, then that doesn't count. If you're dressed in a certain way, that doesn't count. If you're drinking, that doesn't count. And this mythology, this sort of mutual understanding of what kind of a real rape is as opposed to what doesn't count, are these cultural supports for sexual violence that people have identified. If you look at the legal definition of what sexual violence is, the difference between a violent sexual encounter and a non-violent sexual encounter is very clear, right? It rests on force and it rests on consent. And so in the absence of consent and in the presence of force, then this is legally meets the requirements for sexual violence. But sometimes our cultural understandings of rape and sexual assault are different from those legal definitions and make it very difficult for people who are trying to report a crime. Another feature of rape culture is related to the social supports of particular social organizations. And on university campuses, fraternities have been analyzed and understood to be particularly high-risk places for sexual violence. So, as best as we could tell, fraternity, like members of fraternities, are 3 times more likely to rape than other university men. And sociologists have theorized that the reason behind this is the relationship between fraternities and a term called hypermasculinity. Right? Hypermasculinity, you'll find a definition for in the textbook. It is the idea of an exaggeratedly masculine type as being upheld as the culturally, highest status kind of person a man can be. Right? And when we're talking about hypermasculinity in terms of an organization as opposed to an individual, we can identify some criteria that makes an organization fall into this category of a hypermasculine organization, right? And so the way that fraternities fit into this definition are, first of all, their exclusion of women as members, right? And that they tend to recruit individuals who adhere to these ideals of cultural hypermasculinity, and then together, collectively, fraternities tend to enact rituals of hypermasculinity, right? So you may have heard about some hazing stories or even the kinds of ways that fraternities engage in their partying or in their regular daily life. Often include kind of celebrations of this idea of a hypermasculine individual man. The fourth and very important characteristic that researchers have identified as qualifying something as a hypermasculine organization is this understanding of the group identification over the individuals. And so the idea that the fraternity, the brotherhood, the collective is more important than the individual, it gives people permission to override their own moral objections to sexual violence and to go along with the group. And so these are the characteristics that people have identified to explain the fact that rape happens more often in fraternities than outside. Of course, other kinds of organizations are also can be defined in this same way of hypermasculinity. And in fact, we find that those organizations do tend to have higher rates of sexual assault than other kinds of organizations. So this theory that was born in fraternities has been extended to apply, and empirical data was collected from other organizations. So the sort of two, or I should say the one clearly hypermasculine organization that I think everyone can agree on is the military, right? So in Canada, of course, our armed services is an organization that is, tasks with the protecting of the country and with, preparedness for war. And so it's not surprising that sort of strength and fitness and arms and preparing for violence is part and parcel of the culture of the military. But also, researchers have found that, in fact, the kind of on paper inclusion of women in the military has been accompanied with, or I should say, accompanied by hostile cultures, difficulties in terms of harassment and bullying, and then also sexual assault. I think that we don't really have a super great understanding of how big the sexual assault problem is in the military, because the military has a power to kind of keep information within its own organization. But we do have really excellent information on another organization. You might consider it a paramilitary organization, or you might just consider it the National Police Force. So the Royal Canadian Mounted Police is another organization that would qualify under these criteria of a hypermasculine organization. Of course, you've seen the Mounties and understand that they are a uniformed police force that has particular tasks at the federal level. Well, in recent years, we've seen a number of lawsuits by RCMP officers claiming that there has been a history of sexual harassment violence and bullying of women ever since they were allowed to enter the force in 1974. In 2016, 42 years later, the RCMP decided to settle these lawsuits, decided to admit wrongdoing in terms of its lack of ability to enforce the, on the books gender equity policies and the Human Rights Code of Canada. That as an employer, they were unsuccessful in making the RCMP a safe and welcoming place for their women employees. And they issued an apology in 2016 for this decades long history of harassment and abuse. About 1,000 women officers were expected to qualify for compensation, so you can get a sense of how widespread the problem was in the RCMP. They were expecting 1,000 women to have legitimate claims of sexual violence, harassment, or bullying in their personal experiences as officers of the RCMP, and the federal government set $100 million aside to settle these class action lawsuits. It turns out that, in fact, the problem was much larger than even the class action lawsuit expected. To date, 3,000 women have filed. The RCMP has applied to the government for additional funding to settle these lawsuits. Right? And so, one of the things that sociologists want you to keep your eye on when you're thinking about what causes sexual violence and how we might reduce sexual violence, one of the things that we would turn your attention to is to, in addition to the important interpersonal one-on-one factors of sexual violence, to look at the way that organizations set the context that is either conducive to sexual violence or that is not conducive and prevents sexual violence from happening. Okay, I want to talk about another topic, just shifting a little bit, and talk about different kinds of violence related to sexuality. And so I'm going to just call this ritualized violence, and it is a kind of a different kind of sexual violence, right? So it's not interpersonal sexual violence in terms of using sexuality to be violent upon somebody, but it is also being violent upon somebody in the name of sexual norms and sexual hierarchy, right? So just like sexual violence and rape, sexual assault is communicative in that it is a communication to victim that you are, not worthy of your own body autonomy. You are somebody who should be dominated and whose consent is not necessary for a sexual encounter. The communication of each incident of sexual violence is also extended to the group to which the victim belongs. So the gender nature of sexual assault has been widely interpreted to apply to women in general. And we see evidence that this is an effective communication, right? That the high rate of sexual assault is communicated to women in terms of their own safety and well-being, such that women often get both explicit and implicit messages about where it's okay for them to go, where it's okay for you to walk, should you have a partner when you go to the library at night. Even here at McMaster University, we have a whole institution set up to walk women to places at night, because this is kind of a communication that you should not feel safe in your own lived experience. You should feel scared and you should feel at risk, and you should then change your behavior to accommodate that risk. Just like those violences are communicative, we see social patterns of violences that try to enforce the sexual hierarchies, right? And so one of the ways that we have seen this come up is through a social ritual that has been called in the past gay bashing. The idea of gay bashing, and this was a sort of patterned social practice that reached a peak in the 1980s and 90s, of course, right alongside the HIV crisis and right alongside the kind of emergence of a higher visibility for LGBTQ community members. Um, it came with violence against lesbian and gay people or people who are perceived to be lesbian and gay. Right? In fact, these social patterns were correlated. Gay rights claims and violence against LGBTQ people and their people, like I said, perceived to be LGBTQ, it came at the same time. It took a long time before we started to collect data on hate crimes against LGBTQ people. They weren't counted in the hate crimes data. Um, certain groups that were counted, for example, anti Semitic violence was counted, anti Black violence was counted. It took a while for the LGBTQ community to put into place the structures to collect these data. And in fact, in Canada, we still don't have very great data on the social pattern of violence against LGBTQ people. But we do have social surveys that have tried to fill the gap of a government that hasn't collected these data systematically. Right, so we have the GSS in Canada in 2004. So the GSS, you may be aware, is the General Social Survey in Canada. It is a regular survey. We ask people questions sort of on the regular. I send surveys out to samples of Canadians and ask similar questions. But we also sometimes put a battery of questions on just for 1 year, right? And this was the case in 2004. Stats Canada decided to include some questions on LGBT victimization of violent crime. And that sort of snapshot into the issue of gay bashing and violence against LGBT people showed that, in fact, this group is at higher risk of violent crime than the population at large. And that within this group, some factors of intersectionality make you more at risk for violent crime. For example, low-income people are in the LGBTQ community are at higher risk of violent crime. Students, once again, pointing to the kind of place that universities have as and I should say students of all kinds, so high schools, post-secondary, etc. Urban settings were particularly risky, exactly those places where LGBTQ communities have found neighborhoods and where people come together in a visible way and form communities. And then most of these violent crimes against LGBTQ people are happen in the evening. But even controlling for these factors, we find that gay and lesbian people are twice as likely than the general population to be the victim of a violent crime. And for whatever reason, this is even greater for bisexual people. And so let me give you the source on that so you can look up the StatsCan report directly. But this is how we know that gay bashing is still a problem, that ritualized violence is still a situation. And we talked elsewhere in this course about how even within the kind of umbrella term of LGBT, we know, for example, that transgender people are especially at high risk of violence, and that, in fact, even within the transgender community, that trans women of color are especially at risk of violent crimes. And so not only is it a concern for the safety of this community, but also the communicative elements of this should be something that we pay attention to. For example, we should think about the ways that, similar to groups of women, being told that they should stay off the streets or they should stay home at night or they should always walk with a buddy, lesbian and gay people are similarly given or I should say LGBTQ people are similarly given these kinds of messages that their lives are not worthy, their safety is at risk, and that they are doing something sort of wrong and inappropriate. So this is a moment when I'll call back to the moment when early in the class when we made the sexual hierarchies and we thought about the way that sexuality is ordered and organized, and how some sexuality is more privileged and more higher status than other kinds of sexualities. One of the ways that the sexual hierarchy is imposed on communities is through violence. And I should point out that there are also many concerns about how, about reporting here too, about how police departments um, address violence against LGBTQ communities as well. As we think about the issue of intersectionality and the issue of being um, in an intersectional group within a marginalized community, I want to turn your attention to another group that is similarly at extremely high risk of violence, right? And so, just to review the perspective on intersectionality and sexual violence, the idea is that people who occupy social locations that are multiply marginalized. So, for example, people who are marginalized along a dimension of race, people who are marginalized along a dimension of um, sexuality, along a dimension of class, are all kind of seeing that the more multiply marginalized you get, the even greater your risk of sexual violence is. And we have a lot of data on this that shows that this is a case. This is, of course, um, you need to have good statistics to see these patterns, because when you're talking about intersectionality, you're talking about smaller and smaller groups of people. And so the number of statistics that you need to sort of reveal these patterns becomes larger and larger. Fortunately, in the last couple of decades, we've gotten much better at collecting social data on sexual violence, and these patterns have emerged very clearly. One of the groups of people who are multiply marginalized and who are at great risk of violence and sexual violence is Indigenous women, right? So Indigenous women are disproportionately victimized. Indigenous women are more likely than women in general to be low income, right? There are overrepresented among high-risk groups like sex workers, and they are more likely to be victimized because of their age demographic. These are true, right? Poor women in general are disproportionately victimized. Sex workers are disproportionately victimized. Young women are disproportionately victimized. But the thing that Indigenous women have to deal with are racist stereotypes that are very clearly exacerbating the risk of sexual violence. And Indigenous women have had to undergo, as we've already seen in this class, extreme surveillance of their sex and sexuality. Excuse me. They've also had to deal with racist stereotypes about being excessively sexual, and that these racist stereotypes put them especially at high risk of sexual violence. And this is linked to the problem that you may have heard of the missing and murdered Indigenous women. At this point, the particular number of missing and murdered Indigenous women is in dispute, but we know that it's in the thousands of Indigenous women who have been murdered, who have gone missing since the 1970s. The overlap between missing and murdered Indigenous women and sexual violence is very high. Many of the murdered women whose bodies have been found have evidence of that they were victims of sexual violence. Of course, part of this has been a patterned serial murder, serial rape, a set of patterns of serial rape and murders that where Indigenous women were targeted specifically. This is a terrible problem and one that absolutely needs addressing, but it is exacerbated even further by a rather extreme inaction by police departments at the local level and by government at the federal level. And so a lot of the action that Indigenous communities have taken to address the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women is just to try to get the social justice system to pay attention to their claims, to take seriously when women go missing, and to put the same kind of attention into looking for them and into solving those crimes as for other Canadians. And so we have a commission currently that is trying to shift gears of the Canadian government to try to move into a place that's taking this issue more seriously, and we'll have to see if it's effective. We'll see the patterned number of sexual violence against Indigenous women reducing something to closer to the level of an average Canadian. I'm going to end there and give you your weekly to-do list. Of course, you have to complete Module 10. I think you'll enjoy some of the readings in there, even though I know that the topic is a difficult one for many of you. Please read all the readings and then just demolish that weekly quiz, and that will help you feel better about all the feelings of pent-up anger you have over this topic. Thank you very much, and I'll see you next week.